BBC News.
This week, the BBC's religious affairs correspondent Caroline Wyatt looks at why the Jehovah's Witnesses are being sued by former members and investigated by the Charity Commission over their handling of sexual abuse allegations.
They knock on our doors, but what's happening? Britain's Jehovah's believe that the end times are coming. But could their financial doomsday come first, as child abuse victims hold them to account?
I now feel the only way to get the Jehovah's Witnesses to look at their policies and to change it for the better is by taking them to court. And hopefully that way they may then have to think maybe it's time for us to change our policy.
Many churches have faced claims of child abuse. What's striking about the Jehovah's Witnesses is that their explicit policy is to handle such allegations in-house. And it's that policy that led to the High Court awarding significant damages against them earlier this summer. In the report this week, we hear from victims of such abuse who hold the group responsible, and how some former Jehovah's Witnesses fear the organisation's approach can result in the covering up of abuse.
Unfortunately, it's easier to be a child abuser within the congregation of the Jehovah's Witnesses.
I was sexually abused by my uncle, who at that time was a ministerial servant within the Jehovah's Witnesses. It went on until I was about 14. He would come upstairs on the premise that he was saying a prayer with me. He would only be wearing his underpants. He would get in bed with me, pull me on top of him, kiss me on the lips with his tongue, all that sort of thing.
Karen Morgan says she wasn't understood when she first tried to tell her parents what her uncle, Mark Sewell, was doing to her in secret.
Karen at this time was struggling, unbeknown to me, and went missing.
This is Wendy, a family friend and also a Jehovah's Witness in the same congregation. Wendy was the first person to believe Karen when the teenager confided in her about how she'd been abused.
My ex slept on the settee and Karen and I went and slept in my bed, and we laid there talking, and then she told me that her Uncle Mark had been, she didn't use the word abuse, she said he'd been kissing her inappropriately and touching her in her private places. And we were laying there in the dark, and I remember looking up at the ceiling and thinking, I've been duped. And I felt physically sick.
Duped because Wendy had been raped by the same man just months before. He'd apologised afterwards, saying he'd been drunk and depressed, so she'd agreed to try to move on. Wendy did her best to do what she says her faith told her to do, to forgive her rapist and try to forget what happened. But knowing he'd abused others, she couldn't. She told her husband, and they went to the elders and reported the crime.
I think the body of elders were in total shock. The presiding overseer, the man that looks after the whole of the congregation and the hall, said, "But this man pays my petrol. How can this be? He's such a nice man." Karen's father said to the body of elders that everybody needed to examine their conscience and really should go to the police. Not one of them said, "I think you're right, we should go to the police with this." Not one.
Karen Morgan's father, John Viney. Back in 1991, John was also a prominent elder in the Barry Jehovah's Witness congregation.
A procedure was put into place whereby Karen had to face the person that she was accusing. So arrangements were made for two elders to oversee a meeting that we had in our Kingdom Hall, where I attended with Karen, and Karen had to, as a young teenager, say what Mark Sewell had been doing to her. In the room at the time was my brother-in-law Mark and my sister Mary, his wife. Mark denied everything. Jehovah's Witnesses are very keen to adhere to the Bible's rule that you need 2 or 3 witnesses to any event, and since Karen was on her own saying it, really no further action could be taken.
Jehovah's Witnesses believe that any alleged crime or sin must have at least 2 witnesses, otherwise it's just one person's word against that of another. They cite a number of references, including this from Deuteronomy, from their New World version of the Bible.
No single witness should rise up against a man, respecting any error or any sin, in the case of any sin that he may commit. At the mouth of 2 witnesses, or at the mouth of 3 witnesses, the matter should stand good.
In general, that of course is a very good idea. It's always better to get witnesses to something, to prove something.
Karen Morgan's father, John Viney again.
But in a case of child abuse, where someone is secretly taking advantage of a child, it's very unlikely that you will get a second witness. But unless you do, no action can be taken by Jehovah's Witnesses against an individual accused of child abuse.
But now there was Wendy as well, in effect a second witness to their abuser Mark Sewell's predatory sexual behaviour. Wendy too had to describe her rape in agonising detail to a specially convened meeting of elders, held in her own living room.
So I had 3 very elderly men whom I'd never met come into my home, and all 3 of them were making notes like this, and I then had to recount it again to them, and they wanted to know every little detail. I'm not sure if you want to broadcast this, but they were very interested in how far apart my legs were, and I had to demonstrate. So it was excruciating. They asked me that if he was touching me, and did I see his manhood, and all sorts of things. And they said to me, don't be embarrassed. Nothing you can tell us will shock us. Nothing.
And what happened as a result of that?